All right, it has been a minute since we've done the traditional notes thing. Um, we are going to learn a little bit more about the world Darwin was brought into and the world that influenced Darwin's thinking. So, the idea of populations and individuals and animals and plants changing over time was not something new. I think Aristotle had his own kind of philosophies as to how individuals change over time, but Darwin was the most clear and concise about it, so that is why we use him as our main guy when it comes to natural selection and evolution. So, my goal today is to list some of the major points, some of the key contributors to Darwin's thinking, because as we know, the world around us influences the way that we think, um, and give some key points as to Charles Darwin's life before we get into the nitty gritty of his ideas tomorrow. Sound like a plan? All right. I have already gone through here and underlined the really, really important bits just so we're not bogged down writing every single word on the slides down. There's no need to write every single word down. So I've highlighted the important bits. So if there's underlining on the slide, write down just what's underlined. If there's no underlining on the slide, it means that the whole slide is what you need. Cool? All right. See if I can manage this projector without messing up too bad. So, a little preface. This entire unit is kind of focused. Oh, why did I do that? Is kind of focused on, and by kind of I mean definitely focused on evolutionary theory. Now, evolutionary theory is a proposed explanation as to how modern organisms descended from ancient organisms. It is a scientific theory. A scientific theory, so just because the word's underlined, it means I need you to get the whole definition down. So we're going to do both of these. A scientific theory is an explanation of the natural world that is well supported by evidence. That is going to be one of the major skills that we practice throughout this entire unit, is being able to support our answers, support our claims with evidence. Because even outside of science, outside of my class, outside of science class, outside of school, being able to support your thoughts, being able to provide evidence for your ideas makes them that much more credible. If you go up to a boss one day and say, I think we should do this, and that boss just kind of shrugs you off because, hey, they get ideas every day. But if you come up to them and say, hey, I have this idea, I can support it by this, and this, they will be way more likely to listen to that idea because you have the evidence to support it. So that's a skill we are going to learn throughout the entirety of this unit. A scientific focused on science, a scientific theory is an explanation of the natural world that is well supported by evidence. It is a theory because we weren't around thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago to watch evolution happen. We don't have photos and books of all of the plants and animals that were around hundreds of thousands of years ago. We just don't. We do have evidence, though. We have fossil records and like pollen samples from lake sediments. We have things like vestigial organs and lineages and DNA connections, all of which kind of help support the idea of evolution, but it is a theory. So just our kind of preface for the unit. Questions about scientific theories or why we are choosing to take the approach that we are. All right. So, this is James Hutton. He is one of the, I think, 4 old white guys that we are going to talk about today. He was one of the first scientists to recognize connections between geological processes and geological features. He proposed that the forces beneath the Earth's surface, right, magma chambers and tectonic plates, but he didn't really have the words for them, can push the surface upwards to build mountain ranges. He said, well, there is forces that are being or that are at play here that can kind of create landmarks, and if we can watch landmarks be created, that means all of the landmarks here must have been created in the same manner. He concluded that our planet must be older than a few thousand years. At this point in time, in 1785, we didn't have a very good concept of geologic time. We didn't necessarily know that the Earth existed before humans were on it. And he was one of the first individuals that said, hey, maybe the Earth was around when we weren't. Look at all of these mountain ranges. They had to be formed somehow. So he was one of the first people to suggest that the Earth be older than it was, which kind of opens the door for future evolutionary theorists to come in and say, hey, if the Earth is older than this, that means there could have been animals and plants around then that aren't around now. They began to wonder what the Earth looked like before we arrived on the scene. So James Hutton was one of the first individuals to conclude that the planet is probably older than the few thousand years that humans had been around at this point. So he was not alone in this fact. He had a buddy whose name was Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell looked at nature around him and argued that scientists must explain past events in terms of processes that they observe in the present. Meaning, if you can look around outside and see something going on, likely that thing happened in the past, especially when it comes to geologic time. So, ancient volcanoes must have behaved much like current volcanoes, releasing gas and lava. The ancient rivers have carved the canyons we see, just like we see rivers carved through canyons on a daily basis. Right? He said, well, if we're thinking about the earth as old as it is, we have to think of that old earth with the same processes that we observe in current earth. Volcanoes didn't behave differently. Earthquakes didn't behave differently. Rain and snow didn't behave differently. So we have to be able to explain the past using evidence from today. So Lyell's theories, much like Hutton's, continued to prove that Earth was older than a few thousand years. Charles Lyell wrote this in a book, like most scientists do. They didn't have the internet back then. Wrote this down in a book, and that book just so happened to go with Darwin on his journeys after college. So Lyell's ideas of an Earth much more ancient than the current Earth that they thought went with Darwin on his adventures. He had these ideas in his head about how old the Earth was, how there could have been plants and animals and all of these geological processes before humans came around. So these ideas helped Darwin make his final observations, helped shape his observations. Questions? That's Hutton and Lyell. We also have this guy named Jean Baptiste de Lamarck. He's French, if you couldn't tell by his gigantic name. And he was a naturalist, just like Darwin. Naturalists are people who study nature. They didn't necessarily have biology as a study, and it definitely didn't include things like ecology. Um, and he published his hypotheses the day Darwin was born. Um, so his ideas were around for the entirety of Darwin's life. And Jean Baptiste de Lamarck is one of the key examples why we have to sit back and actually think about the information that is presented to us. I'll show you why. So, Lamarck had a couple ideas. He said all organisms have an inborn urge to become more complex and more perfect. He said every living thing has a drive to better themselves for their environment. Therefore, they will use that drive to acquire traits and features that help them live more successfully in their environment. That was his idea. And he called these traits acquired characteristics because organisms acquire them over their lifetime. That's a big one. Lamarck said every living thing wants to get better. And when they get better, those features that they acquire are called acquired characteristics. Now, he suggested that these traits can be passed on to offspring. That if a giraffe was if a giraffe worked out really hard and made its neck all super muscular so it can fight and reach the higher leaves, that their babies would then have stronger, longer, more muscular necks. He called this the inheritance of acquired characteristics. How do we feel about that? Does that sit right with y'all? So let's say I think that if I were to dye my hair red, it would make me better at surviving in my environment. We'll just say that. That would be an acquired characteristic. Yes, it's a trait that is altered by me during my lifetime. That's an acquired trait. Can that trait be passed on to offspring? Ooh, I see a head shake. What does this mean for Lamarck's ideas? Is the inheritance of acquired characteristics a thing? So were Lamarck's ideas correct? Uh-uh. He had some good ideas. He had some thoughts, right? And it's never bad to be wrong. You got to make some mistakes to learn. So he looked at the earth around him and thought that, hey, these individuals are pretty well suited for their environment. They must try to make that happen. And if they try to make that happen, it must help their kids, right? And that was his idea. But we know now, because of our studies of genetics, right, that in order for something to be passed to the next generation, it has to be in our DNA. So, in reality, Lamarck's ideas were incorrect. Organisms don't have this inborn drive to perfection. Evolution's not some predetermined direction. It's not an active choice. Organisms have a drive to survive and reproduce. Everything out there in nature wants to live longer and pass their genes to the next generation. But that isn't necessarily perfection. And it's not predetermined. The environment has a very, very strong hold on what is good and what is bad. And the environment changes all the time. And also, traits acquired by an individual, if I go dye my hair, right? That trait is not passed to the next generation. If something is going to be passed to the next generation, it has to be written in our DNA. These people didn't know about DNA yet. If they did, it was a very novel idea. So, Lamarck's ideas were incorrect. He's a little confused, but he got the spirit. But he's still important, which is why we're talking about it. We can't just spend all of our time talking about the people who got it right whenever the people who got it wrong helped the people who got it right get where they were. So, while he was incorrect in his ideas, he was the first to try to explain evolution scientifically. And for a first shot, he got pretty close. He was able to link environments and structures, which we know or will learn pretty quickly is a very, very strong relationship, especially in natural selection. Organisms are designed to fit their environments. And he saw that connection. And that connection is very important. With that connection out there, Darwin was able to see these patterns that exist in environments a lot clearer. Lamarck had already made the connection between environment and phenotype. And Darwin was able to take that and run with it. And use that thinking, that connection between environment and phenotype, environment and physical structure, to shape his ideas. Questions about Lamarck? All right, so we've talked a lot. Okay, I think I've got one more person. Yeah, this is Thomas Malthus. Oh, my underlines didn't save. Okay, so this is Thomas Malthus. If you remember from the video yesterday, Hank Green referred to him as a grumpy old economist. He was in a big city in France and said, hey, there's a lot of people here, and the more people that are crammed in an area, the harder it gets to live. So he reasoned that if human population grew unchecked, that if human populations grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, there wouldn't be enough space or food. He looked at the economy around him, he looked at the overpopulation, and he said, hey, if this keeps happening, we're not going to make it. There's not going to be enough food for everyone. There's not going to be enough space for everyone, especially if human populations keep growing. Darwin looked at this idea, read his paper, and he realized that this applied more to other organisms than it did to humans. Humans are pretty smart, they know how to work their way around stuff, but there was a word we used in ecology. Do you remember? We had a big graph, and we said that populations would grow and grow and grow and grow until they reach a certain point and they'll kind of level out. This was a logistic growth curve, and it would reach this point right here. What do we call that? This little orange line right here. That maximum number of individuals an environment can support. It's okay to be wrong. We already talked about Lamarck. His wrong answers were way worse than your wrong answers. You remember what this line was? Any wild guesses? Got to get at least one guess. Yeah. Yeah, it's the point where there's not enough space or food. And if this was like chickens or pine trees, right? This is a lot easier to see, right? We can plant a bunch of pine trees and we can know that only a certain amount of them are going to have enough light and water to live, right? We called this carrying capacity first semester. It's the maximum amount of individuals an environment can support. And Malthus looked at people and said, "Yo, if we keep on this uptick in people populations, we're going to reach a point where we can't have any more people." And Darwin was like, "Well, I mean, maybe, but we can see this every single day in other populations, right? Farmers are having fields of cattle. They can only support so many. You can't have infinite cows in a field. Eventually, you're going to run out of space. You're going to run out of food." So, we've talked a lot about Darwin without really knowing who this guy is. So, I got one last idea for you, and then we'll get to Darwin's biography. So, Darwin still, there's one more thing, one more aspect of the world around him that influenced Darwin's thinking, and that was changes produced by plant and animal breeders. Artificial selection is a term Darwin used for when humans selected natural variations in plants and animals that they found useful and they bred for those characteristics. Right? There's a lot of dogs on Earth, and each of those dogs have very interesting characteristics and very identifiable characteristics because those dogs were bred to have those characteristics. If farmers wanted really big fruit every year, right, they would take the trees that produce the largest fruit, they would take those seeds, they'd plant them, they'd take the largest trees, the biggest fruit, they'd plant them until all of the fruit was really, really big and there was no small fruit left because we wanted the big fruit. My stepmom's grandparents did this without even thinking. Every year, they're like 80 something. Every year, this old couple's like since the 70s, this old couple would plant a garden. Tomatoes, green beans, jalapenos. They'd make salsa every year, homemade barbecue sauce. It was great. But in addition to all of this stuff, they would always plant one row of corn. And they'd use that corn to make popcorn, and they'd make a bunch of caramel corn, and they'd hand it out at Christmas, and then people would still have the big box of caramel corn from the year before when they got their next box because there was just so much caramel corn. It's pretty good. We could never make it through it all. But they've been doing this since the 70s, and they would do it in batches. So they would take the seeds from the best tasting batch of popcorn. So they'd save a couple seeds from every batch, and then they'd take the best batch and they'd plant those seeds next year. And then that year, all of that popcorn would have been grown from the seeds from the best batch, right? So they'd take the best batch from that year and plant it for the next year until eventually they had essentially selectively bred the corn that would make the best caramel corn year after year after year. This was artificial selection. They didn't know the word for it. They just wanted caramel corn that would taste really good. Darwin saw this happening even back in the 1800s. And he helped use this idea to explain his idea for evolution. People weren't necessarily a super big fan of this idea of natural selection of evolution. And Darwin said, hey, you're doing it in your garden. Like, it's out there, just on a much smaller scale. And people were like, well, you're not wrong. So we've talked a lot about Darwin's ideas. This is the guy. He was born February 12th, 1809, which is the same day Abraham Lincoln was born. If you're trying to connect pieces of history in your head, it's always nice to have that kind of framework. So he was born the same day as Abraham Lincoln. He was a naturalist, a geologist, a biologist. He grew up real rich and went to Cambridge University. And after he graduated, he didn't necessarily know what he wanted to do. It was all right. So he went on a big old boat trip for 5 years. That boat trip was called the HMS Beagle. This is Darwin at the time that he set off on that voyage. And this is Darwin the way most people recognize him as our famous evolutionary biologist. So, Charles Darwin, kid fresh out of college, got on a boat to explore the world. We know a lot about the world he was graduating into, about Lyle and Hutton's ideas that the Earth was ancient, about Charles Mathis's ideas about carrying capacity and how environments can't always support all of the individuals in it, about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's ideas about connections between environment and physical form. All of these ideas were in this kid's head when he got on a boat to travel the world, and we got a lot out of that trip. So he set off on this beagle. Now, this boat was meant to survey the southern coast of South Africa. So the goal of this trip was to kind of chart paths of the southern coast. And you can see the beagle left Europe through here, went along the coast of South America, around the back of the globe, hit Australia in a couple places, and finally hit South Africa and back up to Europe. Now, here's the thing Darwin didn't know before he got on a boat for 5 years. He was very, very seasick the entire 5 years. Could not stand to be on that boat for as long as he was. So every time they landed, he got off that boat as soon as possible. He was not feeling great on that boat. So he spent a lot of time on shore. And when he was on shore, he did what the activity yesterday had you do. Look at the natural world and make observations. Take some time, take some focus, look at the world around you, and write stuff down. That's really what a scientist is at heart. Looking at the natural world, making some observations, and chasing curiosity. And that's what Charles Darwin did for 5 years on this boat, collecting samples and writing things down, drawing things. I think at one point in time, he spent an afternoon on the coast of somewhere. They had a bunch of lizards that he absolutely hated. Like, he hated these lizards. He'd pick them up by the tail, throw them into the ocean, and count how long it took for them to get back to shore. He was a 25-year-old boy. What do you expect him to do on a beach with a bunch of lizards? So, curiosity about the natural world. So, he made 3 big observations. These are our big ideas that'll really come in handy tomorrow. He noticed that different, yet ecologically similar, species inhabited separate, ecologically similar, habitats around the globe. Meaning areas with similar environments had similar species. That's a South American rhesus, that's an Australian emu, and that's an African ostrich. If I didn't have those labels, could you tell them apart? No. But they're on different continents. Entirely different continents. But they have similar environments. And because they have similar environments, they have similar qualities. So he looked around and he said, whoa, those big birds in Australia look like those big birds I saw in South America. And whoa, those big birds in Africa look a lot like the big birds I saw in Australia and South America. Curious. Similar species inhabit similar environments. That's observation number 1. Observation number 2 was that species vary locally, meaning different but kind of related animals occupy different habitats within the same environment. Right? So he took this chain of islands, right? And they all had very similar environments and they're all very close. And there were 3 species that looked very, very similar, but they were different species. So we got this big old guy right here, this dome-shaped guy down here, and this one right here. These are all big old turtles. But they're different species of big turtles. But this environment let a bunch of animals that look very, very similar inhabit the same space. So, he said species that were like different species that are relatively related often live in different habitats in the same area. And finally, he said that species vary over time. In all of these environments, Darwin looked at fossils. Fossils were very, very interesting this time period, just like now. Love some fossils. So Darwin looked at these fossils and he said, oh, some of these fossil animals look a lot like current animals. A lot of fossils of extinct animals look similar to living species. Now, I'm not going to try to pronounce these ancient species names. But these, everybody but the first one, are all proposed sketches of fossilized animals found in different time periods. And this is a horse. They look kind of similar. Those 2 look similar. Those 2 look similar. Those look too similar. This one and this one, not so much. We can try kind of trace a line. So we thought, okay, that's nifty. That's fun. And it wasn't just this example. He saw this pattern over and over and over again. A lot of ancient species look kind of like modern species. He found fossils that looked like giant sloths, and then he saw a sloth, and it was like that Spider-Man meme, right? He saw a fossil that looked like a giant armadillo, and he looked at an armadillo, and he thought, those look kind of the same. So those were his 3 big observations coming out of that trip. He finished up that trip and he said, okay, I saw a lot of animals, a lot of fossils, and a lot of plants. And I can come up with 3 ideas. Number 1, species that habit similar environments look similar. 2, different but kind of related species will inhabit the same environment. And 3, fossils of ancient extinct species can look a lot like current species. Those were his 3 big ideas. And we're going to carry those big ideas into his proposal for how the world works, which is what we're going to talk about tomorrow. So keep these in your head for tomorrow as we charge headfirst into natural selection. We still have a couple minutes of class.